No, it can't! This is a disaster! We're ruined!
Picture this. You wake up one morning and your life savings are gone. Not stolen. Not lost. Just gone. The bank where you kept every dollar you ever earned has closed its doors overnight. There is a handwritten sign on the window that says temporarily closed. But you already know the truth. There is nothing temporary about it. Your money is simply gone forever. This is not a horror movie. This is not a nightmare. This happened to millions of real Americans on real Tuesday mornings across a real country that had, just months earlier, believed itself to be the most prosperous nation on earth. The year was 1929. And what followed was not just an economic crisis. It was the complete and total collapse of the American way of life. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans who wanted to work could not find a job. Not 1 in 10. Not 1 in 20. 1 in 4. Imagine walking down your street today and knowing that every fourth house you pass contains a family with no income. No paycheck coming. No plan. No safety net. Just fear, hunger, and the desperate hope that tomorrow might somehow be different from today. Fathers who had worked their entire lives were standing on street corners selling apples for 5 cents each just to feed their children. Families who had owned their homes for decades were evicted, and living in makeshift camps made of cardboard and scrap metal. These camps were so common, and so bitterly associated with the president whom many blamed for the crisis, that Americans gave them a name. They called them Hoovervilles. To understand how America fell so far so fast, you have to understand what came before the collapse. Because the Great Depression did not arrive without warning. It arrived after a party. The most extravagant, reckless, and dangerously overconfident party in American history. The 1920s were called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. After the trauma of World War I, Americans were done with suffering. They wanted to live. They wanted to spend. They wanted to enjoy every possible pleasure that modern life could offer. And for a brief, glittering decade, it seemed like the good times would never end. New technologies were transforming daily life at a pace that felt almost magical. The automobile was no longer a luxury for the wealthy. Ordinary families were buying cars on credit. Radios filled living rooms with music and news and entertainment. Electric appliances were changing how homes functioned. Hollywood was producing dreams that millions of Americans paid to watch every week. And the stock market. The stock market was the ultimate symbol of the age. Ordinary people who had never owned a single share of anything were borrowing money to invest in stocks. Buying on margin, it was called. You could put down $10 and control $100 worth of stock. When prices went up, which they always did, everyone got rich. Taxi drivers were giving stock tips. Housewives were trading shares. Shoeshine boys were discussing the market. Nobody asked what would happen when prices stopped going up. Nobody wanted to know. On October 24, 1929, the question nobody wanted to ask got answered. The day became known as Black Thursday. Stock prices began falling in the morning and did not stop. Panic spread through Wall Street like a fire through dry grass. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks watched in horror as their positions collapsed. Margin calls came flooding in. Sell. Sell everything. The selling triggered more selling. Prices fell faster. The following Tuesday, October 29th, became Black Tuesday. The worst single day in the history of American financial markets up to that point. 16 million shares traded hands in a frenzy of desperate selling. Stock prices collapsed. Fortunes that had taken decades to build evaporated in hours. The ticker tape machines that reported prices could not keep up with the speed of the collapse. Investors watching the numbers had no idea how bad things actually were in real time. They only knew it was catastrophic. But here is what most people do not understand about the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 was not the Great Depression. It was the trigger. The match that lit a fire that was already built and waiting. The real catastrophe came from what happened next. From the decisions made by the people who were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. From the Federal Reserve. From the banks. From the government. From leaders who faced the most dangerous economic crisis in American history, and made almost every possible wrong decision at the most critical possible moments. The stock market crash lasted days. The Great Depression lasted a decade. And the difference between those two things is a story about human failure on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. When the stock market crashed, Americans who had kept their savings in banks did not panic immediately. Their money was in the bank, not the stock market. They felt safe. That feeling lasted just long enough to make the eventual panic far more devastating than it might otherwise have been. Banks in 1929 were not the heavily regulated institutions we know today. They had invested depositors' money in the stock market. They had made loans to investors who were now bankrupt. They had extended credit far beyond what their reserves could support. When rumors began spreading that certain banks were in trouble, depositors rushed to withdraw their savings before the money disappeared. These bank runs, as they were called, became self-fulfilling prophecies. A bank that might have survived with calm depositors could not survive 1,000 people demanding their money simultaneously. Bank after bank failed. 9,000 banks collapsed between 1929 and 1933. 9,000. When a bank failed, everyone who had savings there lost everything. There was no federal deposit insurance. No government guarantee. Your savings simply ceased to exist. The money supply of the United States contracted by 1/3 between 1929 and 1933. Think about what that means. 1/3 of all the money in the American economy simply vanished. Businesses that needed loans to operate could not get them. Farmers who needed credit for seeds and equipment could not borrow. Workers who lost their jobs could not find new ones because the businesses that might have hired them were themselves fighting for survival. The economy was not slowing down. It was dissolving. Here is where the story becomes truly painful. Because when the American economy was dissolving, the people in charge of fixing it made decisions that accelerated the collapse instead of stopping it. The Federal Reserve, the institution specifically created to prevent financial panics, raised interest rates during the crisis. Raised them. When businesses were desperately trying to borrow money to survive, the Fed made borrowing more expensive. The reasoning was to protect the gold standard and prevent gold from leaving the country. The result was to strangle an economy that was already suffocating. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, raising taxes on imported goods to protect American businesses. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition begging President Hoover not to sign it. He signed it anyway. Other countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs. International trade, which had been a lifeline for American farmers and manufacturers, collapsed. A crisis that had been severe became catastrophic. President Hoover, fundamentally opposed to direct government intervention in the economy, believed the crisis would correct itself if people simply remained confident and waited. He gave speeches. He formed committees. He urged businesses to maintain wages voluntarily. He insisted the worst was over when it clearly was not. By 1932, industrial production had fallen by half. Unemployment had reached 25%. Farm prices had collapsed so completely that farmers were burning their crops for fuel because they could not earn enough selling them to cover the cost of transporting them to market. The richest nation on earth was watching its people starve while food rotted in fields. In November 1932, Americans made a decision. They voted Herbert Hoover out of office in a landslide and elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. Roosevelt had campaigned on a promise of a New Deal for the American people. He did not have a precise plan. What he had was something the country desperately needed. A willingness to act. A belief that government had a responsibility to its citizens in times of crisis. And an extraordinary ability to communicate directly with ordinary Americans in ways that restored something the Depression had nearly destroyed entirely. Hope. Roosevelt's first 100 days in office moved at a speed that Washington had never seen before. He declared a bank holiday, closing every bank in America to stop the bleeding. He pushed 15 major pieces of legislation through Congress in 100 days. He created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, guaranteeing bank deposits so Americans would never again lose their savings to a bank failure. He took America off the gold standard, allowing the money supply to expand. His fireside chats, radio broadcasts delivered in a conversational tone directly to American families sitting in their living rooms, rebuilt confidence in ways that no policy announcement could. He spoke plainly. He acknowledged the suffering. He explained what his administration was doing and why. For millions of Americans who had felt abandoned by their government, hearing their president speak to them as equals was itself a form of relief. The New Deal programs that followed put millions of Americans to work building roads, bridges, dams, schools, and public buildings that still exist today. Before we talk about recovery, we have to talk about what the Depression actually felt like for the people who lived through it. Because economic statistics, as devastating as they are, cannot capture the human reality of what happened to America during those years. malnutrition became widespread in a country that had prided itself on abundance. Doctors in New York City reported treating children for starvation-related illnesses. In rural areas, families survived on dandelions and water. The image of America as a land of plenty, the belief that had drawn millions of immigrants from around the world, was shattered by the sight of Americans begging for food in cities that had seemed, just years earlier, to represent the pinnacle of human prosperity. The psychological damage was profound and lasting. An entire generation of Americans was shaped by the experience of economic terror. The habit of saving every scrap of food, keeping every piece of string, never throwing anything away that might someday have a use, these behaviors persisted for decades after the Depression ended. Children who grew up during the Depression carried the fear of poverty with them for the rest of their lives, often to the bewilderment of their more comfortable children and grandchildren. Migration became a defining experience of the era. The Dust Bowl, a series of catastrophic droughts and dust storms that devastated the agricultural heartland simultaneously with the economic collapse, drove hundreds of thousands of families off their land. These migrants, immortalized by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, loaded everything they owned onto trucks and headed west toward California, chasing the rumor of work that often did not exist when they arrived. Here is the question that historians have debated for nearly a century. What actually ended the Great Depression? Because the New Deal, as transformative as it was, did not end it. By 1937, unemployment was still above 14%. 8 years after the crash, after all of Roosevelt's programs and all of his fireside chats and all of the legislation and all of the alphabet agencies, 1 in 7 Americans who wanted to work still could not find a job. In 1937, Roosevelt made a fateful decision. Worried about the growing national debt, he cut government spending and raised taxes. The economy, which had been slowly recovering, immediately collapsed again in what became known as the Roosevelt recession. Unemployment shot back up to nearly 20%. The lesson was brutal and clear. The New Deal had been helping. Taking it away proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. What finally ended the Great Depression was something Roosevelt had not planned and did not want. War. The outbreak of World War II in Europe created demand for American weapons, food, and supplies on a scale that dwarfed anything the New Deal had attempted. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the full mobilization of the American economy for war production finally provided the massive government spending that the Depression had always required to end. By 1944, unemployment was below 2%. The same economy that had been unable to employ 1 in 4 workers in 1933 could not find enough workers to fill all the positions that needed filling in 1944. The Depression had not been defeated by patience or optimism or the natural correction of markets. It had been defeated by the most massive government spending program in American history. The Great Depression ended over 80 years ago. The people who lived through it are almost all gone now. But the lessons it taught, and the warnings it contains, are more relevant today than at almost any point since the 1930s. The first lesson is about debt and speculation. The Roaring Twenties looked like prosperity. It was actually a debt bubble. Ordinary people borrowing money to buy assets whose prices were rising only because more people were borrowing money to buy them. Sound familiar? Every generation since the Depression has faced versions of this same dynamic. The names change. Stocks in the 20s. Real estate in the 2000s. Cryptocurrency more recently. But the pattern is identical. Borrowed money chasing rising prices until the music stops. The second lesson is about the danger of doing nothing. Hoover's belief that the market would correct itself cost America years of unnecessary suffering. The instinct to avoid intervention, to let economic forces work themselves out, sounds sensible in ordinary times. In a genuine crisis, it is catastrophic. The Depression proved that modern economies can fall into traps they cannot escape without outside intervention. The third lesson is the most important. The Great Depression did not end because Americans became more optimistic. It did not end because businesses became more confident. It ended because the government spent money on a scale large enough to replace the demand that the private economy had lost. This is a lesson that economists largely accept today. It is a lesson that politicians find deeply inconvenient. And it is a lesson that the next generation will likely have to learn again, the hard way, just as every generation before them has. The question is not whether another Great Depression is possible. The question is whether we have learned enough from the last one to prevent it. So far, the evidence is mixed.